Hi again. Here's more in the series of orphan cars and automobiles. Many of these were produced in Windsor. Others were made in Ontario. This segment will look at Canadian-made automobiles. There's a lot of details here about Ontario car companies and industries, so let's get started. There's a story about a farm boy named Walter Redpath of Keene, Ontario, not far from Peterborough, who supposedly invented Canada's first car. It was called the Redpath Messenger and had a top speed of 10 miles an hour. But that may not be quite fair, because the 1893 Shamrock, built by the Mimna brothers, is recorded by the Canadian Transportation Museum as Canada's first internal combustion engine automobile. It hit the roads 3 years before Henry Ford came out with his quadricycle in 1896. The 1920s were known as the Jazz Age, the age of the Charleston, outrageous stunts, and a general mood of good times that would never end. The Canadian automobile industry grew in leaps and bounds. In 1923, Canada's automotive industry had become the second largest in the world. By 1926, Windsor was the car capital of Canada, with 55 of Canada's 70 auto plants located here. By 1929, there were over 1 million cars in Canada, and plenty of supply industries. Greydork Motors of Chatham started out as a carriage works in 1855 to 1825, went on to become one of the most successful automakers in Canada. After the death of J. Dallas Dort in 1925, things went downhill. Partner Robert Gray tried to find a buyer of the company, but to no avail. Everything was shut down and assets were sold off. Over its 10-year history, Greydork produced about 26,000 automobiles. You may never have heard of the Brockville Carriage Company. They were another carriage maker that went on to produce automobiles. The Brockville Atlas was produced from 1912 to 1915. That ended when fire destroyed the plant. But that's when Briscoe Motors moved in. It was an American car maker. By May of 1916, the Briscoe plant was turning out about 5 cars a day. Not a lot to tell here. Production ended in 5 years. Did you know that Seagrave Fire Engines started business in Windsor in 1904? Well, they did. In 1907, Seagrave delivered its first 3 fire trucks to Vancouver. This 1914 Seagrave pumper served Windsor until 1947. Due to financial troubles, the company closed shop in Windsor in 1923. But in 1930, Seagrave resumed Canadian production in St. Catharines after a long merger with the Vickle Fire Engine Company. That all ended in 1956. The Frontenac badge was first used by Durant Motors in 1931 on vehicles built and sold in Canada. Canadian investors bought Durant and renamed the company Dominion Motors. The company continued building Durant and Frontenac cars. After Durant Motors went under in 1932, Dominion Motors switched to DeVoe as a source of car designs. Just as Durant got in trouble, so did DeVoe. The firm was taken over by its major creditor, Continental Motors, in late 1932. Continental was an engine maker and continued car production under the Continental name in 1931 and 1932. Dominion Motors kept on producing Frontenacs until 1933. Dominion was still the only all-Canadian owned and operated car company. However, Dominion Motors plant also built Rio cars and trucks for the Canadian market. Rio continued to use the plant from 1934 until the early 50s. In 1950 and 51, Chrysler used part of the factory to assemble Chrysler sedans for the Canadian market. We'll have more on that later. The Brooks steam car was made in Stratford starting in 1923, but car sales never really took off, and the company closed production during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Total production, about 180 steam cars. Like many, the McLaughlin Company of Oshawa was originally a carriage maker. In 1907, Sam McLaughlin partnered with William Durant to form the McLaughlin Buick Company. In 1918, it officially became GM Canada. Buicks were grand cars. They were made for luxury buyers. GM closed its Oshawa plant at the end of 2019. A lot of workers were without a job. Back in 2010, GM shut down its Windsor transmission plant and its Windsor trim plant in 2008. In 1925, Chrysler Canada was founded in Windsor, and the Plymouth Q4 was the first Plymouth automobile manufactured in Canada. A total of 60,000 Model Qs were sold in North America in 1928. The Chrysler plant continues to flourish in Windsor, even though its name has been changed a few times. Today it's called Stellantis, after a merger with Peugeot of France. Back in the 1920s, the towns of Walkerville and Ford City were right next door to each other. Ford City was a company town, complete with its own post office. Back in the early 1900s, Walkerville wagon maker Gordon McGregor made a deal with Henry Ford that would see cars made at his wagon works in 1904. 117 cars would be produced that year. Ford of Canada's operations soon outgrew the old wagon works. A new factory was completed in 1910. Ford paid its employees well, $4 an hour. That was quite a lot back then. And it was a smart idea, as they could then afford to buy a new Ford automobile. The times were good. By 1923, about 85% of Ford City residents owned their own home. Auto assembly carried on there for another 30 years. By 1953, Ford was building a new, larger assembly plant in Oakville. And by 1967, another new assembly plant would be opened in St. Thomas to build Ford Falcons and larger cars. However, demand for big, gas-guzzling, larger luxury automobiles was gone, and Ford mothballed its plant in 2011 and decommissioned in 2019. Ford had plans to shut down its Oakville factory as well by 2023, but a last-minute deal saved it. The governments of Ontario and Canada each stepped in and spent $295 million each to help Ford upgrade the Oakville plant to start making electric vehicles. The upgrade will make Oakville Ford's #1 electric vehicle plant in North America. There's no need to tell you more, as you already know about Ford's plants in Windsor and their progress over the years. Another car company making its debut in Windsor was the Hop Motor Company. The Hopmobile was built in Windsor in 2 locations. It began in 1911 in the Medbury Power Building, but outgrew this location and almost immediately built a new plant on Giles Boulevard at McDougall in its first year of operation. The Hopmobile was built from 1909 to 1939. It was an instant hit. Right up until the late 1920s, Hop was a strong contender in car manufacturing. By 1928, sales had reached over 65,000 units. But then with the Depression, the downfall began. In the 1933 model year, both 6- and 8-cylinder cars were built. In late 33, Hopmobile knew their designs were dated. Designer Raymond Lowry created aerodynamic models. The first was in 1934, and then an ultra-streamlined model for 1935. But then the Depression forced a halt to production in 1936. To increase production and handle sales growth, Hop purchased Chandler Cleveland Motors Corporation for its manufacturing facilities. Perhaps a major error in judgment there. Hop was now deeply in debt. Lacking adequate production facilities, Hopmobile partnered with the ailing Graham Page Motor Company to use its core dies. This was the Depression after all, and competition was tough. Graham Page shut down production shortly after the last Hopmobile rolled off the assembly line in 1940, and its automotive assets were later bought by Kaiser. Stay tuned. The story on Kaiser is coming up. Hooray for Nova Scotia! The McKay Touring Car Company represents the first attempt to have automobile manufacturing in that province. It was built in 1912 by the Nova Scotia Carriage and Car Company of Kentville. Daniel and John McKay bought the company and began producing cars starting in 1910. They built the bodies mostly of wood and installed engines imported from the U.S. The McKays were producing a luxury vehicle comparable in quality and price to the Packard. At that time, car financing did not exist, so customers had to pay cash for vehicles. The company wasn't around for long, though. The last car was made in 1914. Now, the Russell Motor Car Company. It was in business in Toronto from 1904 to 1916. The company is considered to have produced Canada's first successful automobile. Tommy Russell had a bicycle-making company, and when business slowed, he shifted gears to make automobiles. He bought the Canadian Motor Company of Toronto that manufactured electric cars from 1900 to 1902. In 1905, Russell produced its first Model A car with a two-cylinder gasoline engine. A more prestigious car would come along in 1908 with a 50-horsepower engine. The Russell vehicles developed a reputation as well-built and engineered cars, and success allowed Russell to focus on the high-end market. Russell promoted its vehicles as the thoroughly Canadian car, built with Canadian material, labor, and capital. A downturn in the high-end market, coupled with the start of the First World War in 1914, resulted in Russell selling its automobile production business to Willys Overland Motors of 1916. In 1908, John Willys bought Overland Automotive and in 1912 renamed it Willys Overland Motor Company. Here's their Toledo factory in about 1915. John Willys went on a buying spree. He bought the Electric Autolite Company in 1914. As mentioned, in 1916, acquired the Russell Motor Car Company of Toronto, and then Curtis Aeroplane and Motor Company of Buffalo, New York by 1917. Still more buyouts, new process gear, a transmission company, and in 1919 acquired the Duesenberg plant in New Jersey. From 1912 to 1918, Willys was the second largest producer of automobiles in the United States after Ford Motor Company. As the U.S. was about to enter the war in 1941, they needed an all-purpose vehicle and they called for tenders. Production of the Willys MB, better known as the Jeep, began in 1941. By war's end, 359,851 Jeeps had been turned out. Later, in 1953, KaiserFraser bought Willys Overland. And here is the story on that company. Henry J. Kaiser was an industrialist who had a passion for big projects. For Henry, no project was too large, and he succeeded at everything he tried. Everything, that is, until it came to making automobiles. In 1945, Kaiser partnered with veteran automobile guru Joseph Fraser to create a new company from the ashes of Graham Page. The new company was called KaiserFraser and used a surplus Ford Motor Company defense plant at Willow Run, Michigan. KaiserFraser was the only new U.S. automaker to achieve success after World War II, if only for a few years. The company produced cars under the KaiserFraser names. Other cars you'll know are the Henry J, the sporty pocket door Kaiser Darren, built on the Henry J platform. Fraser warned Kaiser about a downward trend in sales, but Kaiser wasn't listening. He ramped up production. Consequently, a lot of cars were left unsold in the 1950 model year. Disgusted, Fraser left the partnership in 1951. In 1955, the company became part of the New American Motors. Here's another tale that some may not know. Hudson Motors began assembling cars in Tilbury in 1932. The first models were a series of Hudson 8s and the Essex Pacemaker Super 6. Production continued until the outbreak of war. But post-war operations began in 1950 and ended in 1954 when Hudson and Toronto-based Nash Motors of Canada merged to become American Motors Canada. Here's the story on Nash. Nash Motors was an American car maker based in Kenosha, Wisconsin from 1916. Nash Motors Canada was organized in 1939 as the sales and service arm of Nash Kelvinator. Nash became a division of Kelvinator in 1937. The new Canadian headquarters was located in Windsor. Nash cars were produced at the new Brampton plant from 1951 to 1957. In 57, Nash became part of American Motors in a deal with Kelvinator. You know, a lot of companies had a hard time competing with the big three after the war. Nash was one of them. Like Hudson, it too was swallowed up to create American Motors. AMC took over the Brampton plant, however, and the Nash plant carried on with AMC for a few years after that. The Nash badge carried on with AMC for a few years after the takeover. AMC had a number of brands, including the Rambler, Ambassador, Marlin, Gremlin, remember that one? Matador, Pacer, and the sporty Javelin and AMX, among other brands. But American Motors fell on hard times too, with huge losses. And in 1987, Chrysler bought American Motors Corporation for about $1.5 billion. With it came AMC's modern assembly plant in Bramalea and about 1,400 additional dealers. Chrysler dropped all American Motors brands, except for the Jeep, which remains highly profitable today. Well, that's it for now. Lots more Orphan cars to talk about, though, and I hope you enjoyed this look back. I'll see you soon, and thank you for viewing.